Let me move to a specific moment in the history of the emergency. At the 17th plenary meeting of the League of Nations in September of 1921, Alen Vacarescu, the delegate of Romania, delivered the final report of the Committee Number 5 on the deportation of women and children in Turkey, Asia Minor, and the neighboring countries. Committee Number 5's report stands as one of the first and most comprehensive reckonings of the post-war situation facing survivors of the early phase of the Armenian genocide. That phase had been marked by the separation of men from women and children. Following separation, the men were executed on the spot or placed in labor battalions, only to be executed sometime later. Women and children faced deportation en masse to Mesopotamia, or were left to fend for themselves, placed in orphanages, or killed outright. The committee's primary mandate was trying to understand and address the forms of kidnapping, enslavement, and trade in women and children, and the treatment of non-Muslim orphans that occurred during and after the genocide. Likewise, it was concerned with the taking of Armenian girls and young women and their integration into Muslim households in various ways and capacities. The Western humanitarian community considered women and children sequestered in Muslim homes as slaves, consistently using that term to explain their status and employing the shared vocabulary of emancipation and abolition in their advocacy. Both Armenian diaspora organizations and women's rights groups put tremendous pressure on the League to address this issue. The League's primary efforts took the form of rescue homes, an institution it inherited from the American Near East Relief, where children and women could take refuge and were helped to re-enter society upon escaping from Muslim households and brothels. The largest and most successful of these homes was in Aleppo, Syria, and I'll talk more about this home tomorrow in the history department and also their presentation at St. Sahag Armenian Church. Despite the fact that the records of that home provide ample evidence of official Ottoman complicity in wartime kidnapping, enslavement, and child transfer and genocide, what drew the greatest ire of the Turkish elite were the League's efforts in Istanbul on behalf of displaced and enslaved women and children there. At the center of that conflict was the League of Nations Neutral House. After the armistice of 1918, Istanbul had been occupied by French and British forces. With the post-World War I war in Anatolia between the Greeks and the Turks, and with general lawlessness throughout the region, waves of refugees had poured into the Ottoman capital. Diplomatic and newspaper accounts described bands of street children roving the city and rapid kidnapping of non-Muslim women and girls. Representatives of the League of Nations believed, as did Armenian and Greek representatives, that various Ottoman state orphanages housed children of non-Muslim origin who were being raised as Muslims. Investigations following the Allied occupation of the city found that Armenian boy orphans had been circumcised, given new Muslim names, and forged birth certificates. Armenian and Greek officials, primarily but not always represented by ecclesiastical dignitaries, wanted to recover these orphans and raise them as part of an effort to restore some integrity to their communities. In lieu of the whole-scale liquidation of the orphanages and after Ottoman protests, the Neutral House was established to house disputed children and young women. These were children who it wasn't clear if they were Armenian, or they were Greek, or they were Turkish, and they'd be observed by various representatives from the Armenian Red Cross, by the Red Crescent Society, to determine what community they might belong to, and then they were assigned back to these communities. Now combined, the work of the Neutral House, the programs of rescue and report collated in the field, not just at the established centers in Aleppo and Istanbul, but throughout Anatolia and Mesopotamia, and this is the more important point to raise, led most observers to conclude that sexual and domestic enslavement of women, girls, and boys who had survived the genocide was a widespread and pernicious consequence of the war, which the current Ottoman state was incapable of addressing, and which Ottoman society either ignored or explicitly sanctioned. As Vacarescu outlined in her speech, quote, "The case is urgent, the suffering acute, inequity is unbounded and also unpunished, unbounded the grief which forms the gloomy background of the problem, great is the appeal of the tribunal, which no cry for justice can leave unmoved," unquote. Using both sentimental and legal arguments, the committee asked the Assembly to resolve to do a series of things, but most importantly, to create a mixed board of Armenian, Turkish, and Greek representatives to oversee the further reclamation of women and children, and place the Neutral House under directly control, open additional neutral houses in other parts of the empire to see this through. Also important in this decision, in this series of resolutions, was the authorization of British and French military officers to enter, by force if necessary, the homes of Ottomans and Turks and Muslim households to search for Armenian and Greek women and children. Remaining at the rostrum after completing a report, Văcărescu delivered a lengthy speech, punctuated 3 times by applause, which amplified the sense of the committee that their work had been interfered with by Ottoman officials. More importantly, she also spent the time excoriating Turkey in general for its treatment of Greek and Armenian orphans, girls, and women. Văcărescu, who lived 1864 to 1947, was an author and a folklorist, and is remembered primarily for her poems in connection with the Romanian royal family. One of a number of women in the national delegations of the League, she was, however, the only one ever to be designated with the rank of ambassador. And like most other women at the League, primarily in the delegations from the Scandinavian countries and Great Britain, Văcărescu had been involved in early 20th century movements for international peace and women's rights, including the Paris-based Ligue des Droits de Femmes. At the League, women were channeled into working on issues of human trafficking, public health, and children. More importantly, by 1920, most League efforts on behalf of women and children in the Ottoman Empire and then Turkey were led by women, not only at the level of relief work in the field, but also in administrative and executive positions in Geneva. Unlike other women in the League's delegations, however, Văcărescu had been born an Ottoman subject in the Principality of Wallachia, and her father had fought against the Ottomans in the Russo-Ottoman War of 1877. Ultimately, the speech she gives blends the emancipatory language of women's rights with the religious and racist lexicon of Balkan nationalism, and perhaps even a degree of revanche. Moreover, as discussed below, later Turkish responses to her speech would highlight her Balkan origin and gender as a tactic to undermine her as an expert and authority, and by extension, the entire edifice of relief work in the former Ottoman Empire. More generally, the fact that much of the criticism of the actions of Turkish Muslim men was being made by Western Christian women seemed to arouse explicit resentment from the Ottoman representatives. I'm not going to read you a lot of the speech, to make reference to Oedipus and the harem and so on. A lot of the language is sort of over the top, but I think it's important to share with you at least a portion of it. Sort of this is, imagine it's the plenary session of the League of Nations, so it's all the representatives of the various countries are there. It's sort of at this sort of hall that was, at that time, it was now the Hotel President Wilson along the Lake Leman. So sort of reaching the climax of her speech, she referenced 2 quintessential moments of the genocide: the destruction of the deportation caravans en route to Deir ez-Zor in Mesopotamia, and the drowning of Armenians in the Black Sea near the town of Trebizond. Her conclusion was a call to action. Quote, "I should trespass too long on your attention were I to enumerate all the means of putting an end to these horrors. It will be sufficient if I remind you that every year, every day, and every hour, women and children are going in thousands to their deaths. Because of the crimes they witness, the skies of Eastern Europe, bathed in tears, are incarnadine with their blood." This was applause then followed. "But in this case, we are not confronted by one of those human disasters, one of those griefs, before which pity itself is impotent. These iniquities may be countered by barriers and sanctions. Nothing should stop the will of a collective body when its high and noble will is also the will of the whole civilized world." Following a reiteration of the resolutions proposed by the Fifth Commission, she concluded, quote, "The Assembly and the Council of the League of Nations will, I feel sure, prove once again that thanks to them, the reign of brute force is over and the era of justice is at hand." Loud applause. No members of the Assembly rose to respond to Văcărescu, and following a quick voice vote, the various resolutions were adopted unanimously. The committee's report, Văcărescu's speech, which in tone and content echoed earlier presentations of the League, and the enthusiastic responsible to it and the resolutions authorizing an increased League presence in its relief activities in the Ottoman capital and provinces, especially the legitimization and expansion of the Neutral House's observations, highlight the degree to which a consensual understanding of the events of the Armenian genocide had taken shape almost immediately after the end of World War I in humanitarian circles, and been interwoven with a larger human rights discourse. B, fixing the problems caused by the genocide and the residual refugee crisis was a moral imperative consistent with the League's larger purpose, and C, that the history of the genocide implicated the Turk, quotation marks, here both an ethnic designation and code for Muslims, with a crime against humanity, and that their collective responsibility had placed the national community of Turks beyond the pale of civilization, and irredeemably so. As noted by Bakarescu's speech, as noted above, Bakarescu's speech was not especially unique in content, though sounding somewhat overheated to the modern ear, a consequence of its original French and prevailing oratorical styles at the time. It provides evidence that a narrative history of the genocide had become an unchallenged orthodoxy of the League, and certainly reflected the broader story that had taken root in the publics of various member nations, and that story included elements of perpetual coercive Ottoman policies towards survivors and mass sexual violence against women. Most likely it was also formed by other sources on the massacres and forced migrations of 1915 to 1918, most notably those authored by two diplomats, Arnold Toynbee's Armenian Atrocities, The Murder of a Nation, and Henry Morgenthau's Ambassador Morgenthau's Story.